You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. From the Library of Rillier continues today, with a Mythos offering of my own by the name of The Green Door. There's a green door, and I'm going to tell you all about it. Series artwork by the great Vishnu Prasad. I hope you enjoy this one. The Green Door by Ian Gordon. 1. Email sent to Christian Michael Pickles, 32-year-old office worker, resident of Manchester. Chris, there's a green door, and I'm going to tell you all about it. You might wonder why I'm emailing you specifically, but there's no reason in particular. Well, aside from your reputation as one of the good guys. Ha! To be honest, I've got myself into a bit of a pickle. No pun intended. I noticed something, and I wish I hadn't. It's not looking too good for me. And to think the whole thing got started on the bloody tram. You know what it's like when you catch the tram. It's crowded, seats are more or less impossible to come by, and you spend the majority of the journey looking out of the window because, God forbid, you make eye contact with someone. Your eyes are glued to the world outside, the hustle and bustle of the city, the towering buildings, the traffic jams. And though you see all this stuff, you're not really looking. The odd thing might catch your eye, something designed to catch your eye, a billboard or whatever, but you're not in the business of committing any of it to memory. Not usually, anyway. Well, I'd probably caught that tram 1,000 times, but never once had I noticed the door. I mean, I must have seen it. It's hardly possible not to have seen it, given its location. But that morning, just a few weeks ago now, was the first time I really saw it. On the surface, it was just a regular door, off Moseley Street, set back a bit between two office blocks. But there was something about it that drew my attention. There are probably a million things like that in life, things we see in passing but never notice. The big house at the end of the street, the lone tree on the hill overlooking the cemetery, the ghastly gargoyle above the window. For some reason, certain things just refuse to register, until that moment finally comes along, that mysterious flash of awareness. It's almost as though these things happen by design. Well, it must have been a day or two after I first noticed the door that I found myself walking down Moseley Street on the lookout for a taxi. I'd been out with Gary Chadderton in the Northern Quarter, supping in some bar or other that I can't for the life of me recall the name of now. It was that time of the night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, and it was ridiculously quiet. I hate it when it's like that, because you can sense the opportunistic glares of wrong-uns at the corner of every poorly lit street. Fortunately, though, it didn't look like anybody was out to get me that night, so it was with a misplaced sense of confidence that I slipped off the main road to answer the call of nature. I'm sure you can guess where I ended up. I stumbled into that recess I mentioned, and came face to face with the green door. It was unusual. Looked like it shouldn't really be there. The sort of opening you'd expect to lead into an alley or something. But there was just the door back there at the bottom of a hefty brick building that soared as high as its concrete neighbours. It was a decent size, at least 8 feet in height, I'd say, and about 5 feet wide. And dark green in colour, like moss, a bit tarnished in places. The main thing to note, though, is that it lacked a handle, and there appeared to be no conceivable way to open it. Which, as I stood there that night polluting the wall next to it, suggested to me that it was some sort of fire door, not meant to be accessed externally. Anyway, I'd done what I needed to do and had returned to Moseley Street when After another 50 paces or so towards St. Peter's Square, I heard a shocking squeal behind me. On the instant, I spun around and squinted hard. There was something back there, right in the middle of the road, a massive shadow shape, towering over a much smaller shape beneath it. Whatever the larger of the two was, it was feeding on the smaller one, tearing at it with unseen teeth, like a giant bear devouring a squirming salmon. The squeal sounded again, and was followed by a grisly chewing noise, a truly horrible racket that my reluctant brain refused to interpret. And all this I saw in black and white, the monster, the victim, even the fluids that were expelled from the latter, all oddly silhouetted. I'd seen enough. I turned to run, but not before the massive shadow shape leapt into the air and plunged into the niche from which I'd only seconds ago emerged, the recess with the door. And although something lay in the road, broken and bleeding, living or dead, I couldn't possibly be sure. I took off at a rate of knots, ran home in the end. The next day, Friday morning it was, I boarded the tram nervously. I felt rough as hell, and had considered pulling a sickie, but the part of me that wanted to know whether I'd imagined the previous night's events or not gave me just enough energy to get up out of bed and dress for work. The tram arrived at St. Peter's Square, and I stuck my head against the window, craning to get a glimpse of what might be ahead on Mosley Street. I expected there to be some sort of closure, a diversion perhaps, but this wasn't the case. As a matter of course, the tram flew up the road and reached Piccadilly Gardens without incident. Still curious, but still doubting the reality of my experience, I alighted at Piccadilly and retraced my steps from the night before. But there was nothing to be seen in the middle of the road. Of course there wasn't. The tram would have splattered to oblivion anything that happened to be spread across the tracks. In fact, there was no evidence whatsoever of what I'd watched by the light of a dozen street lamps. Had the creature returned for the remains of its quarry? Had the rain washed the victim's fluids away? As far as I was aware, there hadn't been any rain in the city for several weeks. I entered the narrow recess and approached the tarnished door, still on the lookout for evidence of foul play. There was a horrible stench back there, a real nasty stink that I can't compare to anything. You know that smell that sometimes wafts up from mucky grids at the height of summer? Well, it was like that, but as though the gunk had been reduced down to intensify its unpleasantness. I reckon members of the deep-sea community smell like that when left to rot in the sun. I think it was right then, just as I took my umpteenth lungful of that stink, that my obsession with the green door began. As I said, there was no obvious way to open it, but I figured there had to be another way into the building. After all, it was connected on both sides by perfectly ordinary-looking office blocks. So, having pulled that belated sickie, I made my way round to West Mosley Street, on the lookout for a back entrance. Easier said than done. I couldn't even find the back of the building, let alone a door through which to access it. My phone was no help either. The area, as captured by satellite, was indistinct. It looked as though it had been purposely altered. I mean, the neighbouring office blocks were visible, but the recess section appeared as a tight alleyway connecting Mosley to West Mosley. Didn't I say that the building looked like it shouldn't really be there? I started to question my sanity. You just do, don't you? When things get weird and stay weird, what else can you do? Feeling properly perplexed, I went down to Cooper Street to grab a cup of coffee from the good people at the Bruintists. I fancied myself some spanakopita, but the spinach filling reminded me of the green door, or rather the massive shadow shape as it scoffed the smaller thing in the road. I skipped food altogether. Ordering my drink, I made no mention of the door. I sat by the window and sipped away, contemplating a variety of schemes. Perhaps I could enter the lobby of one of the office blocks next to the mysterious building and find a way to gain access to it. I might be able to convince an employee to give me a tour of the basement or show me a way up to the roof. Yeah, right. I soon gave up on the infiltration idea. I'd come up against a stony-faced security guard, and I'd crumble like a short-crust apple pie. So instead, tail between my legs, I took myself home, determined to come up with something more feasible. I spent the remainder of the day on the internet, scanning endless aerial maps of central Manchester, looking in vain for the tall, narrow structure that sat between those two office blocks, the structure host to the green door, the door behind which something nasty lurked, a thing that came out at night to feed. But it wasn't there, wasn't on any of the maps, wasn't mentioned in any of the literature. Sat at home in front of the computer, I started to feel like the whole thing had happened in my imagination. I mean, that's how it goes, isn't it? Once you're away from it all in a familiar environment, it's almost as though the strangeness evaporates. It very quickly becomes conceivable that what you thought you saw was all in your head. That, in my case, the only thing between those office blocks on Moseley Street was empty space, an inconsequential alley separating two buildings. But I'm not an idiot, and I had no cause to think that I'd lost my marbles. So I pressed on with my research, ineffective though it was proving to be. And when the internet offered absolutely jack diddley to support my cause, I took the search back to the city. Saturday morning, I went back to the scene of the crime and pondered the door some more. The city centre was far from quiet. In fact, a continuous stream of people passed the recess as I stood there, studying the door's tarnished surface with a critical eye. It looked to me as though it had been there for a very long time, half a century or more, and had undoubtedly been opened more times than I could guess, as, on the cold ground beneath my feet, I saw a number of light grooves in the stone, where the door, heavy and metallic, had scored it over decades of use. Done with simply looking at it, I put my ear up against it, listening for evidence of anything at all on the other side. But what a pointless exercise that proved to be, surrounded by the din of the city. It was about then, though, straining to hear, that I became aware of a presence behind me. Exactly when this stealthy individual had appeared, I hadn't a clue. But there he was, a homeless man evidently, poorly dressed and looking a bit rough round the edges. "Can I help you?" I asked, moving away from the door, slightly embarrassed. "I don't know," he replied. "Can you?" His voice was thick with phlegm, his eyes were bloodshot, and his nose looked like a shiny red bauble. "I don't know," I said, echoing his words. "What do you want?" "I want to help you," he said, echoing mine. "With what?" "That door," he said, motioning towards the object of my fascination. "What about it?" "I know what's on the other side." And with that, he had my interest. "Okay," I said, nodding. "What'll it cost me?" "I don't know," he said again, scratching the wisp of hair atop his grimy head. "A tenner?" A pretty reasonable price, I thought. "It's a deal," I said. I extracted 2 fivers from my wallet and handed them to him. "This way," he said, snatching the cash eagerly. And off we went. Not a word was exchanged on the way to wherever he was leading me. I just followed dutifully, finding myself intrigued by his unusual proposition. You might wonder what possessed me to get involved with him in the first place. It was that bloody door, I tell you. Somehow or other, after following a ridiculously circuitous route, we ended up in Sackville Gardens, where a group of the man's friends sat on a grotty bench overlooking the canal. I was invited to join them, and I have to tell you, was pleasantly surprised at the courtesy thrown my way by this band of unfortunate down-and-outs. There were 5 of them in all, 3 of which looked a little out of it, but I wasn't about to pass judgment. The man had given 10 quid, introduced himself as Phil, before referring me to a bulky and intimidating chap by the name of Nige. Demeanour aside, Nige seemed with it, as far as I could tell, and had the look of one who was used to telling stories, a dramatic air that emanated from his dark complexion and waist-length dreadlocks. His face was as round as a football, with a huge scar carved into his right cheek. "What have you got for me?" he asked, eyeballing Phil, but I immediately realised that the question was for my benefit. The cash I'd handed to his underling was essentially a down payment. £40, I offered, feeling generous, but also weirdly anxious to hear what the man had to say. Nige nodded and held out a vast, calloused hand. I parted with 2 20s and accepted the man's invitation to sit next to him on the bench. "Come at night," he began, stuffing the notes into an engorged jacket pocket. "Not every night, but when there be feeding to be done. You see, those things get real hungry down there, living off moss and ferns. Gotta come out when they can to get 'em calories. Do you know what I mean?" I shook my head. I hadn't a clue what he meant. "You heard of 'em froggers?" he continued. "Them who live in others' houses without 'em knowing?" I nodded. "I don't know about you, but where I grew up, frogging was the stuff of urban legend. Used to scare your school friends at lunchtime." "Plenty of froggers in the city," Nige said, looking up at the surrounding buildings, particularly the vacant-looking windows belonging to the upper floors. "We know some of 'em, but them who live on the other side of the green door, they be the original froggers. Froggers before frogging was a thing." There's a short story, I recalled then, by John Collier, about a man who rejects society and moves into the shadows of a department store. He soon learns that he's not the only person to have done so, and becomes an unwitting member of a very unusual hidden society. I wondered, was this the kind of frogging Big Nige was referring to? "You seen 'em, yeah?" he said. "I saw something," I said. "How did you know?" "You've seen the door. Once you've seen the door, they follow." "I don't know what I saw," I said, shaking my head. "But it wasn't human." "No humans down there," Nige stated definitively, and laughed, revealing a surprisingly impressive set of straight, white teeth. I shuddered. The man was leering at me. "Listen," he said, leaning into me. "If you've seen 'em, they've seen you. Do you know what I mean?" Again I shook my head. "Do what we do," he went on, "and stay away from that door." And with those words, the atmosphere changed. Nige had said all he meant to say, and, by the way he turned his back to me on the bench, seemed to want to get back to whatever it was he did all day, down there by the canal. But as I turned to leave, a little mystified, he barked something over his shoulder that for some reason I can still recall with perfect clarity. I'll do my best to type it out phonetically. "Ya, Cthulhu Vertagen." It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Felt like a hex or something. But now, knowing what I know, I'm sure it was a warning. That night, my dreams were strange. More colour than anything else, in stark contrast to the monochromatic madness I'd seen on Mosley Street, with big shapes floating through dark passageways, merging to form hazy, iridescent clouds. Somehow these clouds were after me, looking for a way out of the tunnels, and, like steam forcing its way out of a boiling pan, the things were funneled upwards towards the green door, where they shot out into the night, unhindered, seeking sustenance in the form of my tender flesh. I'm pleased to report that I awoke before those things caught up with me. But the memory of weird, misty faces seemed to linger at the forefront of my mind. Faces beyond description, but faces nonetheless. If things like that came for me in the waking world, I doubt I'd be able to pluck up the will to outrun them. They were all mouth and teeth, mindlessly chomping like vaporous crocodiles. Then the words of the homeless giant, Nige, came back to me. "Gotta come out when they can to get 'em calories. Do you know what I mean?" 2. Sunday. Oddly refreshed and not at all discouraged by the memory of my encounter with the man with the waist-length dreadlocks, I made my way back into town, hungry for more. I'd read of a bookshop on Tib Street, one of those traditional places stocked full of rare and out-of-print volumes. Though the internet is unquestionably an excellent source of information, it's a digital source, meaning that, as I know only too well doing what I do for a living, it's vulnerable to tampering. Much better to adopt a boots-on-the-ground approach, if you're after an accurate view of the world. And what a place that is on Tib Street. It's a time capsule, looking like a set from a Hammer horror film or something. Well, there I was, wandering up and down the aisles, left to my own devices, which, for a socially challenged individual such as myself, is always a blessed relief. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what I was looking for. Perhaps something on the history of the city, something that might have been printed back in the pre-internet days, with mention of Mosley Street. Something to corroborate the vagaries of the big man, Nige. The girl at the desk, a pleasant young lady with the most striking eyes I've ever seen, pointed me towards the local history section, where I immediately found something of interest, a book titled The Floor Below. First published in 1974 and written by a Mancunian called Robert Short, the book deals with hidden Manchester, a network of interconnected spaces, tunnels and waterways that exist beneath the city centre. A quick flick through the book convinced me to buy it, because there was a map in there that seemed to show what I was looking for, the brick building between the office blocks on Mosley Street. Now, I could go on and on about the floor below and hidden Manchester, but let me see if I can provide a brief overview. These underground places, toilets, bunkers, even shops, accessible from various locations across the city, fascinating though they might be, are generally considered to be unsafe. There are numerous hazards below ground, a lack of light, poor air quality, rotten timbers over pits, dangerous debris, you name it. And so, aside from the authorities, few people venture underground, and those that do tend to know what they're doing. Even those who go down there unofficially, photographers, urban explorers and the like. After all, nobody wants to lose their way. But the key thing to keep in mind is this. Manchester's underground labyrinth has never been officially mapped. Subterranean development has been going on for centuries. So, according to Robert Short, it's inevitable that many projects, particularly abandoned projects, were never properly documented. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. As I went to pay for the book, another character emerged from the bowels of the shop, presumably the owner. I'm guessing here, but he just had that look about him. An older gent in a thick turtleneck, with the thickest Lancastrian accent I've ever heard. "So, you've an interest in the underground, eh?" he asked as I pulled my wallet out. "I'm just getting into it," I said. "Not thinking of heading down there yourself, are you?" I hesitated, and the chap seemed to notice. "Well," he said, "if you are thinking of taking a plunge, there's another book you might want to take a look at." From somewhere behind the scenes, he produced this other book, a tatty-looking thing it was, unimpressive. "It's yours," the man said, nodding thoughtfully, eyeing his colleague. I paid for the floor below and left the place, making my way to another favoured spot of mine, Jackie's Corner on Stevenson Square. There, over at least half a dozen flat whites, I skimmed through my purchases, including that stuff I just told you about hidden Manchester. The other book, the author of which seems to be uncredited, is a book called One Fearful Eye. It's here with me as I speak. It describes a hidden society that was rumoured to live in the spaces and tunnels under Manchester, a society that rejected the world above ground. Remember the John Collier story I mentioned? Seems my old friend Nige was at the very least well read. The book suggests that, as the authorities continued to develop the city's subterranean spaces, the society grew fearful of incursion and burrowed deeper underground in order to remain hidden. However, these extreme measures only intensified their fear and paranoia, making them vulnerable to an altogether different kind of intrusion, invasion of the mind. Deeper still, the book continues, miles below the surface, where dark caverns give way to bottomless pits, an ancient being resides, a nameless creature said to be older than mankind. Weakened by their exhaustive digging efforts, the hidden society was said to be targeted by this thing. It came to them in dreams, a huge, swirling mass of a nature impossible to describe. Remind you of something? Over the course of several years, This vaporous monster corrupted the minds of the subterranean dwellers, transforming them into entities like itself, using them in effect as vessels to reach the surface, to provide access to mankind, to satisfy a strange and unfathomable hunger. Pretty weird, or what? There are indications throughout the book that the author was once a member of the hidden society, but who can say? Honestly speaking, the book reads like fiction. But fiction or not, it convinced me that the Green Door was one of several entrances to the subterranean world of that doomed society, and I found myself more eager than ever to find a way to open it. Absolutely ridiculous, I know, but there was no stopping me. The tap of curiosity was in full flow, and the handle had come off. So I went back there, without a plan, and gazed at the door, for hours I reckon, wondering how I might overcome my nemesis. Then I spotted the manhole. Whether it had been there before or not, I hadn't a clue, but it hardly mattered because it seemed to present a solution to the problem at hand. But I wasn't getting that thing open without help. So, under a sky turning steadily violet, I crossed the busy city centre in the direction of Sackville Gardens. Perhaps my new homeless friends would know of a reliable method to open a manhole. Why I thought they'd assist me, I don't know, especially after the big man's verbal warning. But I wandered over anyway, keeping to the quieter streets wherever possible. On reaching the park, I was surprised to see that it was all but deserted, with the exception of a few mindless bench-sitters here and there, their square eyes glued to smartphones. They wouldn't have been aware of my presence if I'd arrived by helicopter. But when I went to Nigel's bench, the grotty bench overlooking the canal, I found the remains of a small fire smouldering on the stony ground in front of it. Bits of charred paper were dotted about, and here and there odd-looking puddles of a dark, thick liquid. There was a stench in the air, faint but familiar. The stink I'd detected down by the Green Door, that indefinable smell that reminded me of mucky grids in summer. What the hell was I getting myself into? On the bench, freshly carved into the wood, was a single word: Azoth. I would later look the term up, and found the following description online. Azoth is a term with roots in alchemy, representing a universal solvent, or a substance thought to have the power to transform and perfect all matter, including the human soul and body. It was believed to be the essential agent of transformation, akin to the Philosopher's Stone. In esoteric traditions, Azoth often refers to a spiritual force or the ultimate source of life, unifying all opposites and enabling the attainment of enlightenment or immortality. I suspect that Azoth, whatever it is, has something to do with the supposed ancient thing spoken of in One Fearful Eye. Perhaps it has access to or control over this substance, and uses it to carry out its terrible transformations. Just a theory. But theory or not, I wish I'd looked it up before continuing with my plan to open that manhole. I left Sackville Gardens with the nagging impression that something awful had happened to Nige and his cohorts, something connected to their knowledge of whatever lurked behind that Green Door. Dusk was all about now, setting my teeth on edge. The streets were intimidating, filled with glaring strangers, all of whom seemed to know what I was up to, where I was going, what I wanted to do when I got there. Twice I had to duck out of sight, convinced that I was being followed, but the surface dwellers of Manchester were the least of my concerns, when, at last, I arrived at that shadowy recess off Mosley Street, and came face to face with an open door. I say open, but it was only just open, providing a pathetic glimpse of what lay on the other side. But it wasn't darkness, the gloom of nighted vaults. No, an eerie light shone from within, an iridescent glow that compelled me to approach. I edged forward in an effort to keep my wits about me, but I could sense that I was losing awareness, overwhelmed as I was by curiosity. That nasty odour once again filled my nostrils, But it didn't deter me, nor did the low drone that seemed to emanate from the door, the monotonous, continuous hum of an alien voice calling to me. My heart beating in my chest, I reached out and clutched the cold metal, momentarily startled by the iciness of it. I pulled the door open, winced as it scraped across the hard ground, and froze. Nothing shocking met my gaze, nothing monstrous, just the light, the strange, iridescent glow that had substance, and to my unflinching eyes whirled and pulsed like the beating of a massive, vaporous heart. And as I watched, unable to move, faces appeared in the cloud, faces strange and faces familiar, as though, it seemed to me, the intelligence at the back of the phenomenon was trying to communicate with me. But something was terribly wrong. Every nerve and fibre screamed it, and so I tried to look away. It took one hell of an effort to do so, but I managed it. And as I did, my gaze falling to the ground, I saw wisps of vapour, like feelers caressing my ankles. And on seeing them, I was instantly overwhelmed by a terrible burning sensation. I cried out then, the reality of the situation crashing down on me like a toppled chimney stack. Everything was clear, black and white, just as it had been that very first night. And from out of the green door sprang that monstrous shadow shape, a mass of whirling members, probing with the desperation of a drowning man. How I avoided it, I haven't a clue, but somehow I did, narrowly escaping its groping appendages. Out onto Mosley Street I ran, wailing like a banshee, passing dozens of people, all of them glaring at me bewilderedly, like I was a lunatic loosed from bondage. And that shadow shape came over the top of them, leaping one moment, flowing the next, a bundle of disparate components pieced together by a disordered mind. But the people on the street were blind to it, or so it seemed, because not a single one of them looked as it swept by, spilling its dark, sticky fluids and giving off that mortuary stench. But after a short while it gave up the chase and left me to run hell for leather into the night, not really caring where I ended up. Why it did so, I don't know, because it was practically on top of me and could have easily overpowered me. I'm not sure what time it was, but I found myself slumped against a wall somewhere under the Castlefield Viaduct. I think I'd drifted off and woke up again before I realised where I was. My head was killing me, and the moss under my backside was damp. But I was alone, thank God. My ankles were stinging, but I'd worry about that when I got home. I limped back. It took me about 2 hours. Went straight to bed, fully clothed. When I finally came round, it was after lunchtime. The sound of rain above me on the roof window reminded me that I desperately needed a shower. Then, thinking of my ankles, I opted for a bath instead. Jesus, what a mess. They looked as though I'd been wearing tight shackles for the last couple of years. A coldish bath took the edge off, and afterwards I applied antiseptic and bandaged them. Feeling a little disorientated and not at all myself, I went back to bed and slept straight through to the following morning, a dreamless slumber at that. What day would that have been? I've lost track. Well, suffice it to say that when I climbed out of bed that morning, physically shattered and worried about my throbbing ankles, I decided to stay at home. No more jaunts into Manchester for a couple of days. Besides, the last thing I wanted to see was that door. I had no desire whatsoever to run into that thing again. But as I went about my domestic chores that morning, I came across the copy of One Fearful Eye stuffed into a trouser pocket. Something compelled me to turn to page 57, a chapter intriguingly titled The Mark. The following passage chilled me to the bone. It, the ancient thing, approaches its chosen victim where the boundaries between worlds are thin, perhaps deep within a cave or near volcanic vents. It reaches out with hands of swirling smoke, brushing against its victim's skin. Where the smoke touches, The skin begins to darken as though bruised, but the marks take on intricate patterns. Over time, the smoke marks spread beneath the skin. Veins turn black, and in some instances, victims begin to exhale faint wisps of smoke. As the markings spread, flesh becomes translucent. In the final stage, the smoke marks completely envelop the victim. Flesh becomes immaterial, dissolving into thick, swirling clouds of vapor. The suggestion of a face glows faintly within the mist, and what passes for speech is now but a low drone on the wind. They are no longer human. Driven by primal urges, their will is under the influence of the creature that marked them. So, there you have it. I'm marked. In time, I'll become one of them. A few days later, I went into the city one last time, hobbled to and from the tram, made my way to Moseley Street, looking for the green door. Well, wouldn't you believe it? It wasn't there. No door, no brick building, just an indistinct alleyway connecting Moseley to West Moseley. I ambled over to Sackville Gardens. Nothing carved on that grubby bench. I'd have visited the bookshop again, to ask the owner what he knew about the author of One Fearful Eye, but I'd gone as far as my sore ankles could carry me. It took every ounce of energy left in me to make it back to the tram stop at St. Peter's Square. And that's it. Everything I know about the green door, and what lurks behind it. And yes, I'm talking about it in the present tense, because I know it's there, has to be there on some plane or other. Now, though, as I sit here, ailing, I can't help but theorize. Why did I see it in the first place? It's like there's a fisherman out there, casting his line, baiting his catch. All he needs to do is show you the door, and your curiosity does the rest. What's the point, though? Why does it do what it does? Do I really have to find out? My dreams are wild, much the same as they were the other week, though now I'm one of the shadow shapes, forced to dwell underground, a servitor of the Ancient One, the thing without a name. The change is coming, Chris. I can feel it. Something in my chest. It's all wrong. Don't bother replying. I won't be here to respond. But I had to tell someone. Had to warn someone. If you see that green door, well, I reckon you'll know what to do. All the best. Rick. Mr. Pickles, considering the email a prank or work of fiction, chose not to respond to his friend and former colleague, Richard Taylor. A short while later, Mr. Taylor's family reported him missing. No evidence concerning his disappearance was uncovered at his flat in Stratford, though over 200 sketches of the green door found inside indicated that he had indeed established an unhealthy obsession with it. Some left-field investigators have suggested that scorch marks found on the bathroom wall forming the outline of a door are proof of Mr. Taylor's transformation and subsequent descent into the depths of hidden Manchester. Officials, however, strongly oppose this view. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.